Heyo, CC here. It's time for another episode of Typical Opinions. In the last video, you all seemed to like the idea of tier lists, so I'll do so for each class's weapons and maybe even cosmetics every few TO episodes. Also, there's some folks that I get every now and then that just say something along the lines of, "Just go play TF2. If you've seen me on my Twitch, which will be linked in the description, you know that I already do. And is it really too much to ask that I enjoy both games in peace? Anyways, this time around I wanted to talk about one of Trooper's weapons, considering the changes to some of them in recent updates. So I did a poll and you all gave your answer. Today we'll be talking about one of the more odd rocket launchers, the Double Trouble. This is one of my personal favorites to use, and I want to get my collectors to fit in zone, but it's a bit finicky to say the least. Is it good? Is it bad? Hard to say. With a weapon, it's usually pretty easy to tell if something is good or bad for certain situations based on its stats, and the Double Troubles is all over the place, so let's take a closer look at them, shall we? The Double Trouble is a primary weapon for Trooper. It's a rocket launcher with the unique property of being able to fire 2 rockets simultaneously, which can allow it to do pretty good burst damage up close. But aside from taking 25% less damage when rocket jumping, that's all there is to it for upsides, as the rest of them are downsides that can hinder its performance. Firstly, each rocket does 35% less damage, which makes sense with you shooting 2 rockets at once. Next, your clip size is reduced to 1, and your reload speed is 66% slower, which is hefty for a rocket launcher considering how vulnerable you now become in between shots, and you deal 36% less push force, in other words, less knockback. Which isn't much of an issue personally, as I usually prefer the target to stay within the relative area of where they are to follow up and not get sent flying, especially if they know how to surf. There is one stat that stands out among the others that is the main factor of its mixed potential. This thing has projectile deviation. For those who don't know what that means, basically your rockets won't go in a perfectly straight line to your crosshair, and instead have a chance to be a little off of it, turning that line into a small cone, like a shotgun blast. Now, 2 degrees may not seem like much at first glance, but it makes a bigger difference than it looks, especially at long range since it makes it harder to shoot at something like a sentry from a distance, crowning the Double Trouble as the least accurate rocket launcher. The only other weapon with projectile deviation is the Wrecker's Yard, and that's really only present when you load in at least 2 rockets before firing. The difference, however, is that the Yard shoots each rocket one by one instead of simultaneously. Going back to the double, it still makes sense to have it considering that close range it's able to one-shot light classes if both rockets hit, and the deviation makes it harder to do so. But if you're going for something to quickly deal with light classes, just use a direct hit. It's also able to one-shot light classes with extra rockets to... What's that, George? Really? Huh. Never mind then. It can't one-shot light classes at close range anymore since the ramp-up got nerfed, which means the double's got a unique little niche of its own now. But even then, the downsides heavily outweigh this one little thing. I get that it makes sense to have those downsides, but the numbers are a bit overboard in most cases, mainly on the reload speed. When compared to the G-Bomb, another weapon with one shot that doesn't have a harsh reload speed penalty, it gets held back by not being able to fire until the rocket you shot explodes, which in most cases isn't even an issue because by the time you start reloading, the rocket would have already exploded or be close to exploding. When it comes to taking out stuff like sentries, assuming both rockets hit, it only takes 2 shots like the direct hit. But the huge time gap in between each shot makes it easier for a nearby mechanic to just repair that damage over and over again. All these downsides become a huge issue when trying to effectively use this weapon in battle, but they don't really change how I feel about it. Personally, I really like this weapon, and it's got good potential depending on your loadout, mainly your secondary. If you're looking for something to up the reload speed, use the buff banner. Even though the man treads have 20% compared to the buff's 10, the banner comes with faster firing speed, which means less time in between firing and starting to reload. Also, I love being a team player and giving mini crits to everyone, and the guitar is awesome. On the other side, it pairs really well with damaging secondaries. My personal favorites are the Family Business, Death Blow, and Boonie Blaster. I don't know what it is about the Family Business on Trooper, but it just works really well with him. As for the other two, I like to use them more as a primary and pull out the double to finish off anyone that's within a good range of health to kill. So it's definitely a weapon that you should pair with a damaging secondary, but you can still use other stuff if you want. That's just how I feel about it. Outside of that, it's pretty good at crowd control when crit boosted in some way, like with the previously mentioned banner or the crits Krieg, next to the deviation allowing you to cover more ground in a single shot. So having that deviation isn't always a bad thing. However, at the same time, the deviation makes it harder to use sometimes. If there's one thing I like on a weapon, it's consistency. The only factor I can tolerate for the most part when it comes to using my weapons is my own aim. With a good aim, anything can be super powerful in the right hands. The double, however, just says "F you" and punishes you for getting bad RNG even though it would have hit with any other launcher. I really don't like the reliability of something being mostly based on luck unless it's done in a way that it's still relatively fair or fun to play with. Even with how much I like using this, I can't ignore the fact that this is one of, if not the worst primary in Trooper's kit. It's just kinda bad. But it can be saved with some proper balance changes to make it better. Instead of only just tweaking some numbers this time around, I have two different ideas as to how this can be made better. The first is keeping the current design of the weapon and only adjusting the stats. First off, bring back the 10% increase in blast radius it used to have. It's not much, but it can definitely make up for the deviation if the rockets ended up getting spread out quite far. The second is a choice of different buffs that can work well on their own, though might be a bit much all at once. These buffs in mind are 1. Increase the reload speed, 2. Increase damage, and 3. Decrease projectile deviation. These are the biggest things that need to be changed, and any one of them or a combination of them would be beneficial. The other idea is to rework the weapon a bit, taking inspiration from another fast-paced shooter on Roblox, Arsenal, specifically the double-barreled shotgun. The idea is to have two different firing modes, the primary being a single fire just like a regular rocket launcher, and the alt fire being the double fire like it currently does. In terms of stats, the single fire's rockets will do a bit less damage than stock, around the same as Maverick, as well as a slightly slower firing speed if necessary, while the alt fire keeps the damage penalty and projectile deviation it currently has. The clip would be up to 2 so that the single fire gets proper use, and it still reloads both at the same time, but slower. The reduced rocket jump damage and push force can stay, but they don't need to if it's seen as an issue. This should allow it to get some better usage as a primary and not be left so vulnerable in between each shot, but still keeping the original design intact with the additions. But that's all I've got for this weapon. It's got a lot of potential, it's just getting to that potential that needs a bit of work. Let me know how you feel about the Double Trouble in the comments below, as well as what weapon you'd like me to cover next. If you enjoyed this, leave a like, subscribe to get notified of future uploads, and thanks for watching this episode of Typical Opinions.